You're listening to Puma Podcast.
Hi, I'm Franco Luna Puma Podcast, and you're listening to Teka Teka News. In this episode,
one cannot just fight corruption in a simplistic way by fighting corruption. One has to see the broader context of governance. But for that, we have to understand and have some kind of consensus. What do we talk about when we talk about governance? And what are the links to corruption and the links to rule of law? How do we measure it? And once we measure it, does it matter? What is the evidence about the consequences of poor governance and corruption?
we're delving into the murky world of state capture and corruption. You just heard Professor Daniel Kaufman. He's Senior Fellow at the Results for Development at the Brookings Institution, as well as President Emeritus of the Natural Resources Governance Institution. He was speaking at the UP School of Economics, where he's a visiting professor at a forum on state capture. Alam naman natin, kilala ang Pilipinas bilang isa sa mga pinaka-corrupt na bansa. Of 180 countries, the Philippines actually ranked 116 in terms of being least corrupt. That's being almost on top 1/3 of the most corrupt countries based on the Corruption Perceptions Index published by Transparency International. But Professor Daniel argues that corruption is not a single entity but rather a symptom of deeper problems in governance. Think of it like a weed in a garden. You can pluck the weed, but if the soil conditions are bad, it will just grow back inevitably.
So essentially, we are very dissatisfied with the traditional approaches and notions of corruption, which focus very much on administrative, bureaucratic corruption, and essentially focus on the bureaucrats receiving bribes and what kind of bribes was receiving, which is very much what was happening in getting around the rules of the game. How, when the rules of the game were being implemented, some of the laws that exist, how do we get around and we get a favorable judicial decision? So that was a traditional notion of corruption, which were much easier to measure in some sense.
Some root causes of this include weak institutions, a lack of transparency and accountability, and last but not the least, powerful vested interests that capture the state for their own benefit. This is what we call state capture. So state capture is essentially when private actors, often businesses, hijack the levers of power for their own gain. They might bribe officials, manipulate regulations, or even influence policy making. It's insidious because it erodes public trust, stifles competition, and diverts resources away from the common good. And Professor Daniel Kaufman says this is important because the whole issue is that most governments only focus on what is illegal when fighting corruption.
We saw that it could be done legally. Why it could be done legally? Because the laws themselves had been captured by the captors and adapted to their own needs and to their own good. So that often was a powerful private and was unduly influencing and corrupting the state institutions, many cases in collusion with politicians and with state actors. And they become the shapers versus the takers of the rules of the game. And that we related to in our work. We saw that it was very much related to the inequality of political influence in who were the most influential political, how weak was civil society in countering these versus some powerful political actors and so on.
You might better know this as cronyism, which does make sense. But he says that what starts as the privatization of rulemaking usually ends in ultimate state capture. And once captured, anti-corruption programs from the government will still inevitably focus on the illegal instead of the equitable. Now, Kaufman has developed a number of indicators to measure state capture, including the Worldwide Governance Indicators and the State Capture Index. These tools have been used to identify countries that are most at risk of state capture and to develop strategies to combat the problem. And under this metric, the Philippines Corruption Control Score put it next to countries like Brazil, Peru, and Ukraine. Take from that what you will.
And here we see Philippines. I'll let the data speak, and you may have comments on that, whether the glass is half full or half empty, and in terms of which indicators doing better or worse. It's interesting to note, the only point I like to make is that compared with its peers in Asia, Philippines has always had better voice and democratic accountability indicators, which will not surprise you. However, there are some clouds in the horizon according to the data in terms of the direction of travel. It's not moving in the right direction.
So Professor Daniel Kaufman presented 6 indicators for measuring governance. The first is, of course, the political aspect, where those in authority are selected, monitored, and replaced. And that basically includes 2 very different indicators. One, the extent of accountability and voice, and democratic accountability, and political stability and absence of major violence and terrorism. Then there's the more economic dimension of governance, which is the capacity of government to formulate and implement policies and provide public service. Under that, there are 2 functions of government which are very distinct. There's the effectiveness of the public sector, the bureaucracy of the government of each institution there, then there's the quality of the regulatory framework. Last but not the least is institutional respect dimension of governance. That's the respect that there is by citizens and state institutions. So how do we stack up there?
The picture given by Daniel in the Philippines is one of mediocrity. It's mediocre in every way. At every index, it's lower 50%. So that reflects in our economic performance over the long period, not over the last year or the last 2 years, but over the long term. Because if you are comparing the Philippines with other regions, our mediocrity is actually normal. The problem is that we are living in a region which is tremendously high performance.
Yan naman si Dr. Raul Fabella, Emeritus Professor of the University of the Philippines School of Economics. A member of the National Academy of Science and Technology, Dr. Fabella was elevated to the rank of national scientist. And he says,
government politicians, for example, their end goal is to get elected in the next election. So if it is to choose between a bridge and a basketball court, a basketball court takes 3 months to complete. A bridge takes 3 years or 4 years or perhaps 6 beyond his tenure. How will he choose? How will you choose if you were trying to win the next election? Basketball court, of course. You will not try to build a bridge that will be inaugurated by the next governor.
We're pausing for a quick break now. When we return, experts will tell us about what the issue of corruption has looked like in the Philippines.
There is an apparent lack of anti-corruption messaging, note the term messaging, under the Marcos administration in contrast to the 2 administrations. But the reason why I say that there's a caveat on messaging is because it does not mean that the reforms are not present. There are reforms present as mentioned by our speakers, but this has been reframed in the areas of transparency and accountability.
That's Strat-based ADR Institute Policy and Regulatory Manager Shanice Espiritu. She was speaking in a forum assessing the first year of the Marcos presidency. Any Filipino knows how bad things are. Almost everywhere we look, we see a normalized culture of patronage and favoritism, forming the bedrock of a system where loyalty often trumped honesty, and loyalty to the crown means self-enrichment. Take the rule of law, for example. The Philippines ranked 100th out of 142 countries in the World Justice Project Rule of Law Index 2023. In the East Asia and Pacific region, Metro Manila actually ranked 13th out of 15. That's despite the fact that so many presidents won off lofty promises to deal with corruption in the country once and for all. Here's a quick history lesson.
For comparison, just to give us an idea of what I mean by this, we need to take a look at the Benigno Aquino administration and his platform. In general, we remember daang matuwid, we remember kung walang korap, walang mahirap. But in the end, we see that his administration has failed to achieve the long-term gains of this anti-corruption policy that he paraded. And Duterte's famous slogan, we also have change is coming, where he promised, of course, to end crime, corruption, and illegal drugs. As we see, not all aspects of that promise have been met as well.
Let's think about the ways the past governments have tried to address the issue of corruption for a bit. Because all countries have laws against corruption, and yet we know it's still around no matter where you look. President Rodrigo Duterte created 3 different bodies to deal with the problem. That's the Task Force Against Corruption, the Presidential Anti-Corruption Commission, and the National Anti-Corruption Coordinating Council, none of which even exist anymore. Change is coming, he preached as he came off Aquino's Daang Matuwid. Except this time around, he also regularly floated off-the-cuff accusations against government officials in his press conferences, but then would refuse to name them. And then the Philippine National Police would then take his press conferences as orders. But as Professor Daniel Kaufman says,
it's very important to have the data, the analysis, and so on, and the evidence. And in part, the power of data is so important because it's not as simple as adopting another decree or just having another commission or another campaign against corruption. That's why for decades I've been already suggesting that one cannot fight corruption by fighting corruption.
On the other hand, President Bongbong Marcos battled corruption by right-sizing the government and doing away with unnecessary bureaucracy. There was a sort of purging that we saw of excessive and unstreamlined positions in the government early on. When Marcos took office last year, his first executive order was also to abolish Duterte's Presidential Anti-Corruption Commission. And during his first State of the Nation address, Marcos also did not mention any specific anti-corruption program. But the thing is, Daniel says neither of them have gotten it right thus far. And that's because culture plays a part. How could it not?
Now, in the past, there were many writings saying that this is all historically predetermined. There have been even genetic theories, and that culture is everything, and therefore it's very difficult for governance to change. Well, not only here it shows how much it can dramatically change over time, but for the worse.
The point is that promoting effective institutions involves more than changing the rules and structures that govern them. So the burning question is this: what actually works? And the data tells us something that might be obvious, but something that bears repeating. We'll leave you with Daniel Kaufman with a prescription.
What works in terms of addressing corruption? We cannot do full justice to that, but in terms of what the data shows, one absolutely obvious determinant, and we already alluded to that, is the extent to which the country enjoys basic freedoms, enjoys voice and democratic accountability, as we see here, a free press and different freedom rights, including rights of women, is absolutely correlated, linked to addressing corruption and to improve governance. Transparency is also obviously related to that, and that relates to press freedom. One emblematic case sector that was so important to address the issues of governance, because it has been overall, with some exceptions, there's been overall poor governance, is in natural resources, and particularly natural resources, resource-rich countries or countries that discover and are exploiting more recently those resources.
And that was today's episode of Teka Teka News. Again, I'm Franco Luna. This episode was edited by Pidoy Blanco. Our Teka Teka News executive producer is Jill Caro, and our senior editor is Veronica Uy. If you found this episode useful, share it with a friend. Help Teka Teka News reach more people and keep the show going. Thanks for listening.